Alright, in this guide, I'm going to be going over how to make your Mac run faster, cooler, and more secure. And we're going to be doing this completely for free. That's right, all the stuff I'm going to be showing you is primarily going to be software tweaks that are built into macOS itself, and I'm going to be using some third-party software, but the third-party software I'm going to be introducing you to is free and open source, so you know exactly what you're putting on your system. That's not to say there isn't some great paid software out there. I personally use some good paid software to optimize my system, but in this guide I want it to be completely free. I am also going to be going over some troubleshooting things you can do with the hardware and that kind of stuff, but primarily it's going to be software focused. The software that I'm going to be introducing you to, in case you're a super advanced user and you know all this stuff already, is going to be System Preferences, Activity Monitor, App Police, Intel Power Gadget, Turbo Boost Switcher, and Coconut Battery. If you heard of those apps before, or if you want to run out and play, go ahead, you can use that. But if you want to find out the kind of advanced tips and tricks that I can share to you, stay tuned and watch. But before we start, if you have any tips yourself, please do leave a comment below, because I want to always learn what I'm doing with my system. And of course, if you're watching this, check out the comments below, because I'm sure there's some super smart Mac enthusiasts out there with some nice tips you can also follow. All right, let's get going. So first up, I'm going to talk about hardware. These are things you can do to improve your system purely by touching it. And basically, the kind of stuff you want to be aware of is your system starting to clog up recently, or has it been clogging up from the start? Has it been a bit slow from the start? Because something you should be aware of, if you've been using your system for a good few years, dust collects inside your system. So what you can actually do, you can open up the case. It's a bit scary, I know, very, very scary, but the good thing about it is today, there's some great guides on YouTube, and for example, if you go to iFixit, you can pretty much just type in the system that you're using. I'm using a Touch Bar 2018, the retro version. If you look at their teardown, you can see that all that's required is a screwdriver to undo the screws. And once that's done, you can actually lift up the case and your system is exposed. Once it's exposed, you can get an air canister and simply blow away the dust. Just make sure you don't point it downwards or upwards, and point it straight.
Warning, warning.
You can also book in an appointment with an App Store genius, and they will actually sometimes dust out your Mac for you. So you got support there for you. Secondly, if you are using one of these 2018 retro MacBook Pros, I find that they use a lot of power. They have a lot of power consumption when you're using the GPU and the CPU at the same time. So if you want a cooler and faster system, a simple thing you can do is unplug any external displays you have. Now this may sound silly, but if you're doing like a long export, you will get about 10% performance improvement just from that. I also find that if you are powering your MacBook Pro, make sure you power it directly using the Thunderbolt ports. Even if you use the official HDMI or USB adapter, it won't actually power at a sufficient rate when your computer is using a lot of energy. So interestingly enough, it actually drains the battery when it's turbo boosting. So I find that if I'm doing some intensive tasks, the power and the battery will actually drain if I'm trying to power the laptop via a USB adapter. Plug it in directly. There will be, of course, some cases, if you're doing some really intensive stuff, that it will still demand too much power for your system. And that, unfortunately, is just an inherent problem with these systems. There are ways around this in software to disable this, but we'll be going over this in the software section. So here you go. If I lower the screen, I'm just going to unplug this to show you what's going on behind my Mac. Move this out of the way. I've just put in some little pieces of rubber on a book that I've got a chapter published in. It's actually a good book. Check it out. OpenGL Insights. I'm a published author, my friends. Yeah, that's where I raised the MacBook slightly, and I've developed my own little dock. The fact that it's raised means that the airflow coming out of this Mac blows a bit out there rather than hitting the table directly. It gives it a bit of space, so it provides a cooler experience. Secondly, you can go through Apple support, and what Apple support tend to tell you to do is things like make sure you're on the latest update. So if you go into the App Store app and go into the Updates tab, if there is a new update for your macOS, it will be listed there. Currently, I'm on the latest supplemental update 2 for High Sierra, so there isn't an update for me, but if there were, they'd say make sure you're on the latest update because there are some patches they can fix. Another thing they tend to do is they sometimes ask you to perform an SMC reset or a PRAM reset. An SMC is a system management controller chip, and what that does is it controls things like, for example, ambient light, fan speeds, that kind of stuff. And to do an SMC reset, it actually varies on your kind of Mac. So if you've got a Mac with a T2 chip, there's a different procedure to be following. So make sure you just follow the right procedure. I'm not going to show you how to do this stuff because this stuff should be common knowledge. I'm not going to go too much in depth in this stuff. Just letting you know in case you're not aware of it. These guys are very simple to use. Just after your Mac shut down, press and hold its power button for 10 seconds, depending on your system, of course. So you can follow this guide yourself. There's also something called a PRAM reset. And again, it depends on if you're using the T2 chip or you're not using it, because there's another way to use it. So make sure you just follow the right guide when doing this kind of stuff. But the crux of this stuff, what I want to go into is software related stuff. And I'm going to start off with macOS software. So firstly, I'm going to launch the System Preferences app. And I'm going to introduce you into the tab called Security and Privacy. And over here, what you want to go into the firewall setting. And currently I have my firewall on. You might have yours off. What you do is you click on that lock, type in your password, and you can turn off your firewall or turn it on. Now you want to turn on your firewall because what a firewall does is it blocks connections from the internet accessing your computer. Now apps need to access the internet to function, but not every app needs to access the internet to function. You don't want just like an open door. And if you go into firewall options, you'll find a list of all the connections that I've allowed, and I tend to just block as much as possible because a lot of these apps, they don't actually need to function. Some of them do, like for example compressor.app. If I'm using compressor to make a render farm, you want it to be accessing the network so you can use your system as part of that render farm. But for me, I don't do that stuff, so I have it disabled. You can also block all incoming connections. So sometimes apps would ping every single IP address that's on the network to try finding out if you exist or not. You can block all that stuff and give you a bit more security. What I tend to do is enable something called stealth mode, and what that does is it doesn't acknowledge any attempts for these standard apps to ping and find out if there's a Mac living on your current network. Now this is especially crucial for areas such as if you go into a school or a college or logging into public networks, because on those systems you've got a lot of computers connected and people can start doing some brute force attacks on your computer. Secondly, for just a tiny bit more performance, I always disable it, but I'll show you anyway. So in privacy, you want to go into something called analytics. So in this area, what Apple does is they tend to send certain information about how your computer's operating to Apple so they can improve their product. Now this runs in the background and it doesn't tend to use that much resources, but for maximum performance, you don't want background services running. So I tend to disable that stuff. It's up to you. If you feel happy with your state, you can keep it open. Secondly, what I want to show you is something called extensions. Now, whenever you install a new app on your system, kind of like copy into it, these apps, they're very rogue. They always try to install their extension into Finder. For example, Backup and Sync from Google, which is Google Drive. It allows you, when you right click on Finder, to add folders and all that kind of stuff to Google Drive. This uses up extra resources. I tend to disable as much as I can get away with. Next, the sharing tab. Now, this one is a bit very, very key. There's a couple of services here. Now, firstly, there's something called Bluetooth sharing. Now, what you can do is never allow other devices to browse your system. That stops other devices connecting to your system and seeing what's going on in your shared folder. Now, for the top part, when receiving items, I allow people to send me items over Bluetooth. Now, this Bluetooth sharing doesn't affect AirDrop whatsoever. And next, file sharing. If you enable this, you have exposed your Mac to danger, okay? When you enable file sharing, even if there's no shared folders on your system or even if there's no users, what that means is your Mac is now accessible on your network. So I can go on another Mac and I can log in, and if I know your username, if I know your admin username, I can type in your username and I can continue to guess your password for as many attempts as possible. File sharing enabled. Boom, my MacBook's there. Now look what I can do. Connect as. What is that? Hit connect. Oh, I can know the username. Ooh, now I can continue to guess what the password is 1,000,000 times in a row and there is no timeout. What a complete, utter mess of security. There needs to be a timeout built in. You shouldn't be able to brute force this baby. Look at that. Constantly changing the same password. So I'm going to do this 50 times, 50 times, 50 times. brute force. And then I'll type in the right one and it lets me in. And this is access to my friggin' Macintosh drive. This is access to everything. Everything. There is no maximum timeout or anything like that. I can do a brute force attack and access your computer. So whatever you do, if you're in school or if you're on a public network, make sure that file sharing tab is disabled. You want to have that disabled. That one, it's an open hole to a nightmare. And of course, if you have people accessing your computer's hard drive, they can start installing apps that are bad. They can start doing some dodgy stuff. And more importantly, they're using up your resources. Next up, screen sharing. That one is a really cool feature. If you don't know about it, check it out. But again, have that disabled. That one actually allows other people to log into your system and see exactly what's going on in your computer if that tick is enabled. So turn this stuff off if you don't need it. Next up, I'm going to be going into Energy Saver. So Energy Saver has a tab at the top if you're using a MacBook Pro, the 15-inch one with discrete graphics. And it has an option called automatic graphics switching. What that does is, when it can turn off the discrete GPU, the graphics card of the MacBook Pro, it will. If it can't turn off the graphics card that's built in, it won't. It's very, very clever. It works pretty much 99.99999% of the time. It's a really great feature. Have that turned on, so that way when your monitor is unplugged, it will go into integrated graphics mode, which uses a lot less power, keeps your MacBook running cooler. Next up, we're going to be talking about T2 security. And what T2 does is a co-processor that handles things, for example, like file transfer, encryption, audio, that kind of stuff. And it can get a bit overwhelmed. You can throw too much stuff at it. For example, every now and then, my audio would cut out and it would reconnect after a couple of seconds. It gets a bit overwhelmed. To help that out, if you go inside T2 security settings by resetting your computer into recovery mode, just hold down Command and R at the same time. Once you're in, you want to go inside Utilities and Start Up Security Utility. You can actually disable T2 security, or you can at the very least set it to medium. That allows it to do less work, and if it's doing less work, it's got more space to do stuff that you actually want. Now, of course, turning off these security features does reduce the security, so it's up to you to balance it. I find that I don't want the T2 chip forcing me to access Apple's servers to ensure my operating system is correct, and I want to be able to boot off USB drives. So I disable that stuff, but it's an option for you. Now I'm going to be introducing you to an app called Activity Monitor, which is built into your macOS. So if you search for Activity Monitor and launch it up, if you go into Window and select CPU usage, GPU history, and CPU history, you're going to see a lot of options on the screen. And this is the current state of my Mac. You can see that my graphics card is currently being used around 25%. My internal graphics card is not being used. And I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 cores. Now, technically, I have a 6-core MacBook Pro, but that 6-core MacBook Pro has a feature called hyper-threading. And what that does is it treats each core as 2 cores. This helps alleviate traffic if there are apps blocking the root, but for now, you can assume that I have 12 cores, 12 areas for apps to take over. And on this screen here, I'm going to be going into the CPU tab, and I've sorted my apps by CPU. So you can see that OBS, which is the software I'm using to record the screen, is using 80% of my CPU. What that means is using 80% of one of the cores. And you can see Activity Monitor itself is using 10 to 20% every now and then. So by monitoring the performance, it reduces the performance of your system, because every single segment, it has to take a snapshot of what's going on in your system, and this takes time. You can alleviate this by going into View, Update Frequency, and change it from every 5 seconds to every 2 seconds, to me every 1 second, because I always close this application when I'm not using it. So I've got a lot of applications here, and I can see that OBS is using 80%. What you can do, if you don't like a certain app, you can force close it, or you can just quit it from the dock. But at least this gives you an idea of what's going on in the background of your system, what could be hogging up resources. It doesn't unfortunately give you a history of the app. For example, maybe this app is clever, maybe it's some kind of virus. When it detects Activity Monitor is running, it shuts it down. It doesn't do that, but it's a start. Next up, I want to show you the memory tab. What's cool about this is it shows you on the bottom right here how much physical memory you have, how much memory you're using, how much is in the cache, and how much is in a swap, and how much is compressed. So just a quick brief on what this stuff means is wired memory is memory that cannot be moved. It has to stay in memory. App memory, it can be compressed. It can be played around with by the operating system. The dangers of what happens is if your wired memory gets too big for the amount of memory that your system currently has, you're going to get a lot of issues because your apps can no longer sustain itself. And secondly, as the amount of RAM, the app memory, grows, the operating system is going to have to start doing some clever things with managing it. For example, it will try to compress that RAM and save it to the SSD optionally. And what that means is every single time you go back to access that, it's going to have to uncompress that RAM, put it back into the memory, and then use it. So if you're constantly switching between apps and it's constantly have to compress and uncompress apps, you're going to find that this makes your computer run a little bit slower. So what you kind of want to do is just make sure that you're not using too much RAM. So if you look on the main segment of this computer, you can see that I've sorted by memory. And I can see that a kernel task is using the most amount of RAM. And kernel task tends to be things like, for example, file operations, stuff that the system's currently doing. So in this case, OBS is using 700 megabytes, but you can see that the kernel task is using 2 gigabytes. So from my assumptions, I can see that OBS is using RAM. The kernel task is probably the video file that's currently being saved to my SSD via OBS, but there's no direct link to that. What you can do is sometimes if you get a spawn service, you can see who spawned that service. So for example now, just say there's an app I'm not sure of, just say caffeine. I'm going to click on info and it's going to tell me all the files it's being used. So here I can see that this is the location of the app. So it's inside my applications folder, tools, caffeine. Let's see, applications folder, tools, caffeine, there it is. And it's running the app which is inside it called caffeine itself, which lives inside contents macOS. And that's correct. But it's also using this file. It's also using that file. It's using that image to display on the taskbar. It's got a car file. It's using that font. It's using all these different libraries, and that kind of makes the app size grow. But the good thing about it using libraries is libraries are shared across other applications. So for example, macOS provides lots of different libraries to use. So don't be surprised when you see apps using other libraries on your system. It's just part of the process. But if there's an app you don't know about, you can kind of get some hints as where it's existing in the world. So over here, my memory seems to be good. Next up, I'm going to show you energy. Now, energy kind of shows you the stuff that kills your battery. And it's kind of like a pseudoscience. It's an estimate of what's going on. It's not an exact representation. It's not 100 watts here or there, but it tells you what's the biggest hog of your resource. So right now, you can see that OBS is using pretty much 77% or points of my energy on my system. So if I close that down, I'll have a greater battery life. I can see also I've got a firewall here that's using 0.1 to 1%, just blocking all these kind of connections in the background. And this is using energy. The great thing about this tab is it has something called average energy impact. And what that does is it tells you on average how much of your system's resources is being dedicated to this app on regards to energy. So even though right now OBS is using 80 points of the energy, overall it's only used a third of that, because I haven't been recording this whole time. I've only started recording a little while into its life cycle. Okay, next is disk. Now this one is going to give you some tips on what is going on with your system in the background, disk and network. So right now, MDS stores for me has written 2 gigabytes of data. Now, what you can do is you can go into the Google if you don't know what the app is, and you can find out what it is. And it tells me that it's actually part of Apple's Spotlight services. What Apple has is a service called Spotlight, and it goes ahead and indexes your hard drive data to help you find folders, apps, files, all this kind of stuff in the background. To help you find all this stuff, which means when you launch the Spotlight service, that question mark at the top there, you can type in whatever, for example, Chrome, and it will have it listed on your system. And this has to run all the time in the background to index your data. Now this is written 2 gigabytes of data. Not sure why it needs 2 gigabytes of data, but it's been open for a while, so I'm not too worried about that. And it's official Apple app, so I'm not too worried about that. Other things, I can see that FFmpeg has written some data, Sublime Text is doing some stuff in the background. But if you've got like a rogue app running in the background, writing all this stuff, reading lots of files, could it be a virus? Probably. Next up, network. Now this is the dodgy AF apps you want to look into. And this tells you how much bytes is being sent, received, and how many packets of data is being sent. Now, bytes is kind of, it's more useful than, well, it depends. Packets is the number of packets it sends across the network. Bytes is like a figure, the amount of storage it sends. I personally would sort it on sent bytes or received bytes. Probably the best thing to do is first sort it by sent bytes, because what you want to know is, do you have a rogue app on your system sending data from your computer onto the internet? And if you sort by sent bytes, you can see that the most used one is a core one, it's core speech. So that's probably Siri trying to detect my voice. Whoa, what's that? What's that about? That's dodgy. That's only sent 2.7 megabytes. So I don't think it's been sending some dodgy webcam videos of me. So I'm pretty content with that. Of course, the problem with this view is it doesn't include the history. So if an app notices that you open up Activity Manager and closes itself down really quickly, you're not going to have a record of that. But, you know, are apps that smart? Are programmers that smart? Are criminals that smart? Maybe, I don't know. Don't hack me, please, thank you. All right, but I'm going to go back to the most important tab, the most useful tab here, and that's CPU. And here we're going to find out CPU usage. So right now I can see OBS is using up 98% of my CPU. And it's causing my fans to actually spin up really loud. I'm going to launch an app called Max Fans Control. Fortunately, this one is not open source. I'm just using this app to show you my fan levels. And you can see that it's using around 5,000 RPMs. The maximum state is 6,000 on this system, but for now, the Mac is running at 5,000. It's audible, I can hear it. So something is running in the background, and that is OBS. So what I can do is, I can launch another app called Intel Power Gadget. Intel Power Gadget, I mean, you get the idea. You just go to the link. This one's by Intel.com. And the great thing about that app, it actually gives you a reading of your temperature and how fast your processor is going. So right now, you can see that my computer's using 15 watts for the CPU. The CPU package itself is using 15 watts, which isn't that high, it's pretty low. Now, the more watts you use, the more heat is generated. The more heat is generated, the more fan noise will occur, because the fans have to ramp up. So in an ideal world, you want a CPU that doesn't use too much power, but unfortunately, every now and then, some apps come along which are poorly programmed and they ask for too much CPU usage. So here you can see that my computer is running at 3 gigahertz. Officially, this CPU that I'm using is the Intel i7 2.2 gigahertz, 8th generation. Now that one runs its base clock speed at 2.2, but it is turboing at 3 gigahertz, which means it's going to use more energy than its base level. So to mitigate this whole situation, I mean, I'm only using 70 degrees at the moment, so it's not that bad. But if I launch an app called Turbo Boost Switcher, check it out. Type into Google, it's the #1 on the list right there. But what's cool is if you check out the 4th list, the github.com link by the same developer, you can see that it's actually on GitHub. How cool is that? On GitHub, you can run it, you can modify it, you can have some fun. This guy is cool AF. He's put his code up on GitHub for you to play with. I can actually hit disable turbo boost, type in your password. It will now disable turbo boost, which will make my CPU run at 2.2 gigahertz. If I launch Max Fans Control, what you actually see is the fans start to ramp down. So even though in Activity Monitor, OBS is using 120%, it's still using a lot of the CPU, it's actually going to get quieter purely because I've told the CPU, you know what, don't go as fast as you can. Everything's still recording, this video's still being recorded, everything's still working fine, but the fans are now going 4,900 and they will continue to drop. Now, of course, disabling turbo boost will slow down your system. It won't make it go as fast as it could go, but the win is it makes it less noisy. Another thing you can do, you can kind of use sniper mode. Now this is pinpoint precision mode. Instead of using Turbo Boost Switcher, you can use another app called App Police. Alright, so just type in App Police on Google. The guy Fuyu has it on GitHub. And there it is, that's all the source code. The Xcode project will run on Xcode and you can modify all the source code. So it looks like what you want to do is go into releases and you can download a pre-compiled version. There you go, apppolice.dmg, and you can run that and have a play with it. Now, the great thing about this app, and it's so great actually, I've even modified the source code myself because I really love this app. And if you are interested on how to modify the source code of any of these open source apps, just check out my coding channel or just leave a comment, let me know, and I'll make a guide for you. So over here, I've got a running apps window, and I can see all the apps which are running. And I can see, for example, Google Chrome, I've got lots of Apple apps, I've got Intel Power Gadget, all this stuff. So I'm going to set up a methodical test for you. I'm going to launch Backup and Sync by Google, and that app is notorious for using up a lot of CPU. It's using 100% of a core, and I've seen this app use a lot more. This is just it currently indexing from the server, 100% of the CPU, purely just to do some background stuff on Backup and Sync. Now, if you want the fastest, of course, let it do its thing and endure the pain and the sluggishness. But for this app, what I love to do, just click on running apps, select Backup and Sync, and you can limit it 10%, 20%, 5%, and it will respect that limit. Now, I've limited it here to 10%. You can see it's running at 9%, 8%. I'm still going to click it. It responds a little bit slower. Not as fast as it would, so I click and I need to wait a bit, click, need to wait a bit, but it's still running in the background. So I love this App Police app. It allows me to kind of like, instead of kind of turning off my turbo boost, instead of, you know, going a bit crazy closing down apps, it allows me to keep some of the apps that I like running in the background, but tailor make it. For example, I'll give you another example. I'll load up Xcode. So I'm now running Xcode, and I can see that a service called Diagnostic D, which is actually a service provided by Xcode, it's using 130% of my CPU. And I'm going to limit it to 30%. Here you go. Diagnostic D, no longer using 130, it's only using 30. Great thing about it is Xcode still fully works. For example, if I put in a breakpoint, I can still step through the code as usual. Alright, let's end that. Now, I'll be honest with you, I tend to stay away with any of the Apple apps. I find that interfering with them can lead to some consequences that you might not be aware of. So I tend to just leave that stuff alone. I only play around with the custom third-party apps. For example, Google Drive, that's a big one. I always make sure that it doesn't use too much. Or if I'm reusing like a background service, for example, Node.js, and I want it to just run silently in the background, not use too much CPU, I can use App Police for that. If I'm doing a transcode for a video using FFmpeg, I can sniper that one to make it not use too much CPU. And this is open source, so you can go ahead and modify the code. For example, you can have it automatically start up when your computer is idle, and when you start using your system, you can have it enable all of the sniping and the limiting of the CPU, so you have a more luxurious experience. Lastly, just for fun, I'm going to show you another cool feature of this app. I'm actually going to tame down OBS. Let's see. I made it 40% of the CPU. Now, this is what happens when OBS is limited to 40%. Has it gone slower? Is it not recording? Probably, because it needs more CPU to encode these videos. So that's why you don't limit the wrong apps. Some apps need to use this much energy, but other apps don't. Depends on your mileage. So I'll just disable that one so you can see what's going on my screen. Next up, I'm going to show you an app called Coconut Battery. Coconut Battery, boom shakalaka. You know how to get these things. Coconutflavor.com. And this one is free. It's not open source, but it's free. And what's great about this one, it tells you the design capacity of your computer. So if you've got one of these MacBooks and they've got a battery in there, over time your battery will degrade. What it does is it tells you that's how much the capacity should be, and it tells you what your current full charge capacity is. So that's 7,218. You can of course get these settings from the Apple menu, about this Mac, system report, and the power. So you can see right there that the full charge capacity is 7218, and it's currently fully charged even though it's at 6,862. That's what it classifies as fully charged. But I kind of find, I like this app. It makes it easier for you, but again, this one isn't open source, so you can't tweak it. But what I like about this one is it kind of like summarizes it for you. Good status, here's the temperature, how much battery is being used. It says 0 watts. That means it's using 100% of the power coming from the power supply. It's not eating into the battery for high performance tasks. And it tells you the design capacity of the computer you're currently using. So it's a nice app to use. I'm gonna close up shop now. I think I've gone through enough, and this video's gone way longer than I thought it would take to explain this stuff. I hope you found this useful, and again, if you have any tips and suggestions yourself, leave a comment below, and make sure you check out the comments below because some smart people are going to say some smart things, fingers crossed. And you know what? I've got a lot more things to say, so I'll probably do a follow-up to this video if you request it. But thanks for watching, and I hope you have a more pleasant, cooler, faster, more secure experience with your Mac. Now, let's go watch some porn. Check it out. What is this? Look at this guy. He works for friggin' AMD. This guy works for Intel. This guy works for friggin' Nvidia. What's this fella doing in the mix? What is he doing? What qualifications he has? This guy should be banned off YouTube. Get back to the desk.